Great, thank you. Thanks very much, Joe, for that kind introduction. I'd like to start. In Australia, we have a custom of acknowledging the First Peoples of the country on whose country we're meeting. And this is a custom of Indigenous peoples themselves, but it's also a really important part of redressing some of the devastating impacts of colonisation. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Tongva and the Chumash peoples of these lands, and we're very excited to be meeting some of the Chumash traditional owners of this land on Wednesday. I'd also like to pay my respects to First Peoples here in the audience and to any people who are also on Zoom in the various lands that you come from. I've myself had the great privilege of working with many different Indigenous groups in Northern Australia over the last couple of decades. I've been working alongside Gurindji people who are here in the audience, Bilinada people, Mutbura people, Ngariman mob, and documenting your very precious and fascinating languages. And to all those people, I'd like to say thank you. I'd like to pay particular respects to just a few people. Here you have a photo of Violet Wadrill here, who's Leah Lehman's grandmother. Violet Wadrill is the person who taught me about Gurindji language. She's has the most fabulous mind, an absolutely encyclopedic mind. And I think it has to be said that in a better world, she would be the professor standing up here talking, not a non-Indigenous linguist. I'd also like to acknowledge Cassandra Algie, who's been a real partner on a lot of the research that I'm going to share with you. Rosie Smiler, who's also travelled with us from Australia. She's pictured here with her book that came out last year, Freedom Day, which is about some of the recent history of Gurindji country. And also Leah Lehman, who's also here in the audience. And I've got a picture of her standing there with termite mound because we've had a project fairly recently on termite mounds. And I think Leah's been a fabulous person who really connects Western science with Indigenous knowledge systems. And all of this is really important in interdisciplinary research, which is what we're all about in this particular project. So I'm going to talk about the linguistic expression of spatial relations, then some of the cognitive work that we've been doing, and then look a little bit forward towards asking the question about whether there's a neurological basis for spatial cognitions, which Joe introduced. So first of all, I'll just let you know that by spatial relations, I'm referring to the linguistic encoding of angular relations between objects. And I'll talk more about this shortly, but it's specifically coordinate systems which can be used to express the relationship between two objects separated by space. And you'll see many examples of this soon. So just to orientate the non-linguists and non-Indigenous members of the audience, before colonisation, there were 350 languages spoken across Australia and many more dialects. There's one large language family, which linguists call the Pamanyungan language family, and then, which is spoken across most of Australia. And then up in Arnhem Land, around here, regions of the Daly River area, and then the Northern Kimberley area, there's another 28 language families. All of these languages have really fared badly since colonisation. So of those 350 or so languages, there's maybe 40 that are still being spoken, mostly in remote regions, and perhaps only 12 that are still being learnt by children continuously since colonisation. So now across Northern Australia, you get an English-based Creole language that's spoken. There are mixed languages. Gurindji Creole is one example of that. Cassandra, Rosie and I have worked a lot on Gurindji Creole over the last couple of decades. And also actually in the last couple of decades, there's also been an incredibly inspiring galvanisation of First Nations communities who are revitalising their languages. And I know the same things are going on in Northern America, and I have incredible respect for these endeavours. So in Australia, there's now school courses for children, there's high school courses, there's university level courses in First Nations languages. And also languages are finding their place in contemporary art and music too. And a lot of the projects that we run at Gurindji are run through Curran Arts. Penny Smith, the art manager, is here, and they bring together art, they bring together science and language and culture. So we're very much interested in interdisciplinary work. Okay. So it had been long held that human spatial cognition was universally based on an egocentric orientation. So this is underpinned by bodily coordinates, and it finds its linguistic expression in left-right systems. So, you know, the typical English speakers of from most Western cultures will say things like the pencils to the left of the book. Except, of course, I did that the wrong way around because I don't know my left and right very well. But anyway, what's particularly interesting is that Indigenous languages in Australia are completely different. They're based on geocentric orientation. So people don't use left-right systems unless they're speaking English, but instead rely on cardinal systems. So by this, I'm talking about north, south, east, and west. So instead, many Indigenous groups across Australia will say things like the pencils to the north of the book. And by this, I'm talking about in very small scale space, like tabletop space. So these geocentric systems, cardinal directions particularly, are really widespread across Australia. There's other systems. So for instance, there's river drainage systems. So some groups might say the pencil's upstream of the book, and you don't necessarily have to be near a big river system to say that. And then there's this cusp region in north central Australia where both systems are used. And actually in Gurindji, you get both river drainage systems, so Kangara and Kanambara, and you also get the cardinal direction systems like Peda, Kulada, Kalada, Kanada. Okay, so this is Gurindji country. We're now in Northern Australia. These are a set of languages that are all related, which linguists call them Yapper languages. So there's Bilinara mob, Ngarinman mob, there's Maungin, Yinin, Wulai, Mutpura. So it's a whole language family, and Gurindji's bang in the middle of that there. So in terms of spatial relations in Gurindji, the use of geocentric terms, so north, south, east, and west, is incredibly pervasive, and it's the main way of indicating direction. So there aren't terms for left and right. There are words for left hand and right hand, and again, I've done that the wrong way around. But those terms aren't used abstractly away from the body in the same way that English speakers are used. Instead, there's river drainage terms, and I'm going to leave those for this talk and just talk about the cardinal directions. So each of those directions, north, south, east, and west, has 32 different ways of saying those. So 32 inflected forms. It's an incredibly complex and fascinating system for linguists. And they're used in large scale space, so giving travel directions. That might not seem too unusual. It's also, these directions are also used for objects that don't have inherent facets. And you'll see an example shortly of a tree and the side of the tree being referred to using cardinal terms. And also really interestingly in small scale space, so tabletops, and you'll see an example of a small ochre pit. So the first example that I'll show you is of Leah Lehman's grandmother, Violet Wadrell, who's cutting down a tree to make wooden dishes called kulamons or kaola. They're used to carry babies around in, but also when you're gathering fruit and this sort of stuff. So she's cutting the tree down. She's been given instructions from another woman that I've worked a lot with, Biddy Wavehill, and there's another woman in the video who's since passed away, Nangalaye, who's also been given instructions. Okay, so I just subtitled the relevant part of that, which was that Biddy Wavehill was giving instructions to her sister to cut the south side of the tree. To give you an example of even smaller scale space, this is a very small ochre pit. The women are here, so this is again Biddy Wavehill and Violet Wadrell, and they're collecting ochre for ceremony, and Biddy's talking about the ochre being kind of busted up by the water, but also which side of the pit they should be digging around in. So within that very small space, which is maybe not even 1 metre by 1 metre, she's talking about concentrating on the side of the pit to make sure that, to get the best bits of white ochre. Okay, and just in case you're not already thinking, oh, this is pretty interesting, this is an example, again, from Violet Waddrell, where she's talking about where a fly has landed on her. So even parts of the body are actually orientated cardinally. So I'll play this example. You might not be able to hear so well because of the computer speakers, but it's really the translation and the transcription up there that's of interest. So look out for that first word there. Okay, so she's talking about a fly that's landed on the upper west of her leg. So, you know, the really interesting thing about this is as people who are English speakers, we would talk about our left leg or our right leg, and if we turned around, the left leg and the right leg would be the same. When Violet's talking, when she switches her body around, of course, 180 degrees, the west leg becomes the east leg. So this is a very different way of conceptualizing the world. And you can also see that it's a very complex word. So you've got the root form there, color, from colora, which is the west form, and also a whole bunch of inflections on that. And that's just an example of how complex these words get in Gurindji. An inflection are those word endings, sorry. Yep. So the inflections are those word endings. So you've got west as the root, and then you've got the up form ni, and then the edge form mbal, and then yini, which is the source of something. So those are the inflections. Yep. Oh, just check I've got the right slide. Yeah. Okay, so this system of spatial relations have undergone some changes with younger generations. So there are fewer forms of north, south, east and west. But what we're really interested in is the functional range of these cardinal terms. So they're still used to express ternary relations like x is to the east of y. But cardinal terms are generally mainly found in descriptions of large-scale space. They are found in small-scale space, but generally diacritics are used. So diacritics are things like this side, that side, or this one, that one. And particularly when the objects in their context aren't visible or known to the hearer. So if you're inside of the building, the person's outside of the building, if it's nighttime, that sort of thing. And I'll show you some linguistic tasks that we use specifically to bring these out, and these are called the man and tree tasks. But I'll just give you an example of Cassandra and Rosie, since they're both here in the audience, a video from about, I think, 15 years ago now, when we were going around the old station called Jinbarak, and Rosie and Cassandra are talking to each other. I've just gone off to get the vehicle and I think some soft drinks or something, sodas. And you can hear them using cardinal terms just pervasively.
You can't go corrupt name, the Cardinal come down, go to the Kaira, one of your well.
Why is now Egon?
Felicity, you know, cooking Yan and go to the Cardinal, bring him to the color at the side.
Yan in your gum.
Yan in your come, Punyunga.
Okay. Sorry to embarrass my colleagues there. But you can see just lots of use of cardinal directions in that little excerpt there. Okay, so that's large scale space. What we did to have a little bit more of a look at small scale space was use these man and tree tasks. So these were originally created by Steve Levinson's group at the Max Planck Institute in Nijmegen in the Netherlands. And the idea of the game is that you have a director. So in this case, it's Amanda who's sitting here who has a board in front of her with lots of little pictures that just differ slightly, and they've all got men and trees on them in different positions. And then somebody else has a loose set of cards in front of them, and Amanda, and there's a board separating them. So the person who's doing the task can't see what the director's looking at. So there's a board here. So this is Rosie holding the board and Cassandra writing down the observations. So then she'll be describing which side of the tree the man's on. What we're interested in is what kinds of linguistic resources she uses to describe those trees, the sides of the trees. So we did this both with adults. So we've got a control group of 10 adults, and we also did this with children. So we've got 30 children. Again, you can see Cassandra running the task where we've got someone here who's got the board in front of them, and then Conrad here who's got all the loose cards in front, and he'll be listening to her asking for particular cards depending on which side the man's on. Okay, so when English speakers perform this task, and speakers of many, many languages around the world, they'll say things like the man's to the left of the tree or the right of the tree, depending on what you want. So, or left to the right of the tree. Gurindji adults, so this group will use cardinal directions. So they'll say things like the man is to the south of the tree, the man's to the north of the tree, east, west, depending on which side of the tree that they're on. And what we're interested in is what children did too. So children also use cardinals, but they also use landmarks, which is quite interesting. And we're not sure whether this is a developmental thing, like the children are still learning cardinal directions properly and they're using landmarks as kind of quasi cardinals, or whether there's some language change that's going on. So if we have a look at this, you can see that the adults are pretty much using cardinal directions all of the time. They never use the left-right system. There's some other things going on which we won't talk about, but you can see the children are using both cardinal systems, but mostly landmark systems. So a landmark might be something like the man's on the house side of the tree, or the man's on the church side of the tree, or something like that, depending on what's in their immediate space. And children do use some relative terms too, but again, very rarely. If we look specifically at the cardinal directions, adults are using the cardinal directions all relatively evenly. You can see the percentages across there. So this demonstrates that they've got comfortable control over the entire system. The children are a little bit different. So they're very strong with east and west, and use north and south much less often. Instead of north and south, they'll often say things like the house side of the tree, or the man's on the church side of the tree, that sort of thing. So this maybe isn't surprising that east and west are still quite strong, because the cardinal system is anchored in the trajectory of the sun. Okay, so where we've got to now is that we have different languages referring to small scale space in different ways. So broadly, English uses an egocentric system like left and right. Gurindji people use a geocentric system like north, south, east and west. So one of the things that we were interested in then are whether there are cognitive consequences for different linguistic expressions of space. So the NeoOrphans would say that the way a language encodes physical space affects the way that people think about space. And one implication of this claim is that where language change is observed, there's also there should be changes to spatial cognition. So where a person or a community, for instance, is shifting from one language to another, there might be changes to spatial cognition. And this is a change, there is language change going on between different generations of Gurindji people in Northern Australia, which affects the cardinal system. So just to recap, to introduce you to some other colleagues, this is Topsy-Dod Nanjal, who I call Sister. She's a senior songs woman in the community. We've done a lot of songs documentation work with her. Her daughter, Deborah Vincent, and her little daughter, Vikara, who's quite a bit bigger now and, you know, actually speaks. Just to use this family as a recap, the older generation use cardinals in large and small scale space. The next generation down use cardinals in large scale space, and in small scale space when you can't see what the other person can see. And then this youngest generation, not so much Vicara, but little kids who are actually talking, use landmarks, some cardinals, and occasionally left and right, but not so much. So we're taking this linguistic situation and now looking at it from a cognitive point of view. So Cassandra and I ran a whole series of what get called animals in a row rotation tasks. So these are non-linguistic tests of spatial cognition. Again, this is a task that's come out of the Steve Levinson's group at the NPI in Nijmegen. So what happened would be that participants would see 3 animals lined up along the ground. Here's your participant here, along a left-right axis relative to their viewpoint. The participants were then instructed to memorize the animals. They then turned 180 degrees and walked about 5 meters ahead. Cassandra then picked up the 3 animals and handed them back to the participant. There was also a 4th animal thrown into the mix, which just puts a bit of load on memory. And then she instructed the participant to reconstruct the sequence of the animals the same way, but in Gurindji or Gurindji Creole. So each participant performed 5 trials of the task with different configurations of the animals, and the trials were coded as either a relative response here or an absolute response. So this kind of task has been done cross-linguistically around the world. If we just go back to English and Gurindji speakers, English speakers who use a left-right system tend to pick the animals up and then reconstruct them according to the axis of their body. So you can see then that this pig that's on the left then becomes the pig that's on the left when you switch 180 degrees. On the other hand, Gurindji speakers, as we'll soon see, actually do the task in an entirely different way, where that pig remains, let's say, south and remains south there. So this is a robust task that's been done cross-linguistically in many different cultures across the world. Okay. So there are 107 people who participated in this. That's about 1/5 of the community. So there were 30 from that grandparent generation, and then 77 adult and child generation. So we were pretty sure that the grandparents would use that absolute response, so this response here, because that would be consistent with their use of north, south, east and west terms in the language. The adults and children, those predictions were a little bit less clear. So there's not as much use of north, south, east and west, but it's not being replaced by a left-right system either, even though the school in the community is an English-only school. So they've had certainly some exposure to the system in English. What we found was that all participants across all of those generations gave very strong absolute responses, which is really indicative of geocentricity. So this is regardless of what kinds of language they're using in an everyday sense. What was kind of interesting was participants with a tertiary level education gave significantly more responses that looked like relative responses, like they're English speakers, which might be a result of exposure to English. I'll talk about this, and perhaps associated literacy practices. But I think the take-home message here is that this attention to cardinal directions has cognitive effects that show that Gurindji people really have a mental map of the world that's probably anchored in the trajectory of the sun, but it's in constant operation, whatever time of the day it is. And there's a few more sort of follow-up questions that we have for this. So we're curious to know, well, you know, children are using north, south, east and west a little bit less often, but they're still very clearly sensitive to this geocentric system. And we think that part of this might be a bit more of an influence of culture rather than language. If you go and have a look at some of the papers that we've written, I go into a lot more detail about this. This has been looked at across the world, and people have found fewer effects of culture. Other people do suggest that things like ecological zone, dwellings, subsistence mode, and this sort of thing do have an effect on the kinds of cognitive responses that you give in these rotation tasks. So yeah, there has been cultural change that's taken place across generations of Gurindji people, but Gurindji children still grow up in a context where knowledge of their traditional country remains really important to Gurindji identity. And I've just got an example here. So Leah Lehman's a really wonderful artist who's here in the audience. This is another artwork which I thought might demonstrate a little bit better this point, but a lot of the artwork that's done in the community is done from a sort of bird's eye view. So a lot of artwork are, in a sense, maps. This one actually literally is a map. It's a map of Old Wavefield Station that was done by Biddy Wavefield and her husband who passed away last year. So I won't say his name. But so clearly there's an attention to geocentric cues that's going on in these kinds of cultural practices. The other thing I think that's really important to note is that when people are describing country, both visible and distant, it's always accompanied by gesture. And this gesture relies on absolute points in space. So for instance, at the moment I'm giving this talk and I'm just waving my hands around. And I could be pointing anywhere and it really doesn't matter. If Gurindji people are telling a story, a historical story or a story about spiritual connections to country, the gesturing is absolute. So they'll always point in, you know, wherever the action had taken place in the story. So this is an example here, again, of another old man who's passed away recently, but he was an amazing orator and has told a lot of histories of Gurindji country. We're all out on country here, very sadly, near a massacre site. Brenda Croft, who's the photographer, sitting on top of the roof rack of a trophy, so you can see the action that's going on there that we're recording. And then the insert there is the Malaga, the old man who's telling the story. And the parts that I've highlighted there is he's telling the story of where people had to run and escape from massacres from white people. And he's using cardinal directions all through this story, and his gesturing, as I'm sort of showing with the compass point there, is accurate to the story. Another really interesting, so I guess what I'm the point that I'm trying to make is these are cultural practices that I think have ensured that although compass points maybe are not used as much as the older people use them by younger people, they continue to have a really salient realisation in everybody's lives. I'll give another example here, again from Cassandra, who's sitting here in the audience. This is from a sign language project. So as well as spoken language, there's a Gurindji sign language called Daga Daga. We ran a project a number of years ago with Jenny Green from University of Melbourne, where we were documenting the signs. One of the things that I found really interesting is that there's a space-time remapping that goes on with the sign language. So this is an example here where the sign for tomorrow and yesterday are mapped along the east-west axis. So you might be gesturing for today and tomorrow along here. I don't know which way east and west is at the moment, or you might be gesturing in an arc along here. So this is Cassandra Algae demonstrating this space-time remapping.
Kabut. Yesterday we showed that sun.
And now just talk yesterday.
Yesterday, like that sun yesterday.
Okay, so people on Zoom are going to be hearing the sound a little bit better. Okay, so those are examples of the way that cardinal directions are really encoded culturally, and we've already seen them encoded linguistically. I guess another question that we came up with from this study was why Western people with a really strong Western education experience sometimes used egocentric responses when nobody's really using left-right terms that much. Yeah.
Question about that sign language. If Cassandra turned 180 degrees, would she use the opposite sign?
Yeah, yeah. And if she turned just 90 degrees, the sign would be given that way. That's right, isn't it, Cassandra? Yeah. We've got confirmation in the audience. Yeah, so I mean, look, this is actually quite an interesting outcome out of that sign language project, something that I hadn't noticed. And it came about actually because I think Cassandra or maybe another family member was telling a story and was using this sort of directional, and then told the same story the next day but was facing in a different direction. I realised the sign was going the opposite way. I think it was Nigel. And so I thought, oh, okay, this is because I don't take much notice of gesture, but actually gesture is really important for Gurindji mob. Okay, so and I guess another question is really why the Western education experience. So I said before that people with a tertiary level of education gave more egocentric responses, even though left and right aren't really terms that are much used in the community unless you're talking to non-Indigenous people. So I suspect this is an influence of literacy practices rather than language. There's an immense literature on this, which you can find in this paper that's referenced. What we have to sort of think about when we're thinking about literacy is really left-right orientated. So even when we're progressing a story, we turn pages from right to left to progress stories. Sentence direction is left-right directional, of course, in some cultures, sentence direction goes the other way. And even letter directionality. So if you want to distinguish between a B and a D, you know, that's a left-right rotation as well. And directionality, there's a large literature on this, and writing systems particularly has been shown to affect other areas of spatial cognition. So I think it's really literacy rather than bilingualism in English that's the crucial factor here as to why some people were using this egocentric responses on the animals in a row game. So it's not language shift so much, maybe that's reshaping Gurindji cognition. If there is some reshaping going on, it's really an introduced cultural activity. And I think, you know, this is something that's really important to think about. We're often in Australia and in other colonised parts of the world talk a lot about the effects of colonisation on First Peoples. I don't think anybody's thought about the incredibly subtle but really important effects that this has when you're talking about people who are really, for which country is very important, are very grounded in country. If you're introducing particular forms of education, so monolingual education in English, and you're actually starting to change the way that children's cognition works, I think this is actually a really devastating effect of colonisation, something that, you know, just doesn't get talked about. Okay, so this is where the talk gets a little bit more speculative, and probably the part of the talk that if you have some more detailed questions, Joe is probably in a much better position to answer than me, but we'll see. So we've seen that, just to sort of bring us to the point where we're at, we've seen that Gurindji people have a highly complex morphological system, language system, which is based on cardinal directions. It's used pervasively with ease in everyday life. And there's also a lot of cultural practices which similarly reflect this attention to geocentric cues, to this sort of mental map of the world. And we've also seen that this mental map of the world is reflected cognitively. So the question that we have, and the reason that we're here, is whether there's a neurological basis to this ability, so magnetoreception, or in a sense a human sixth sense, in addition to things like touch, sight, hearing, etc. So this is the work that we're doing here with Joe's group and also Shin's group. Okay, so it's long been recognised that some bird species have a remarkable ability to find their way home, like homing pigeons, and their impeccable sense of direction is the result of being able to detect the Earth's magnetic field. We've also seen this is the case, some bacteria, bees, salmon, rats, and even dogs align the length of their body along a north-south axis when they're marking out territory. They can locate bar magnets, for instance, in 3 alternative force choice experiments. So there's a good literature on this. And the idea is that this ability comes from magnetite crystals in the brain, which have a deep evolutionary history. So humans also have these magnetite crystals. So the question is, and this slide comes from Joe, so I'll blame him for the Homer reference. The question is whether humans also have magnetoreception or a sixth sense. And what I'm doing now is reporting on research that's come out of Joe's lab. So there's, this has been something that's been of interest for quite a while. So Baker in 1980 and 1981 conducted a study at the University of Manchester. So students were blindfolded, thrown into a van, which sounds a little bit like kidnapping to me, but driven around in convoluted routes. And then they'd stop the bus and ask the participants which direction they came from. And they got significant results from this particular work. But since then, nobody's been able to replicate the task. So for instance, in 1981, Gould and Abel repeated this task with Princeton University students, but couldn't replicate the results. So fast forward to just a few years ago. So Wang and with Zhou and Xin's lab were interested to see whether there are passive brain responses to the Earth's magnetic field that don't involve other senses. So for instance, the visual field or the vestibular system. So this is the sensory system that's responsible for providing our brain with information about motion, head position, spatial orientation, that sort of thing. And it's also involved with motor functions that help us keep our balance, stabilize our head and body during motion. So what they were wanting to do was tap into the very subtle brain responses at a subliminal level, so an unconscious level. So participants sat in a Faraday cage, which you can see there, which is soundproof. There's no light, and it's used to control the Earth's magnetic field. Joe and others will be able to explain this a little bit more, but it's inside is a nested 3-axis coil set that can manipulate the field in just small ways that imitate the way it might move when someone's walking around, for instance. But in this case, the vestibular system isn't being activated because the participant's sitting there passively, and that's what's important about this. So participants were tested to see if they could unconsciously detect changes to the magnetic field. The alpha waves were measured using a 64-channel EEG, and the alpha wave is the dominant electrical signal produced by the brain when you're awake with your eyes closed in a relaxed state. It's around 10 hertz when one of your senses is activated, like the visual, smell, auditory cortex, and the alpha wave is suppressed. So this is the brain's signature for detecting senses and for moving attention towards it. So what they found were that alpha waves were suppressed after particular rotations. So this should play, yeah. So counterclockwise above, as you can see. So it showed that humans do have the ability to detect the Earth's magnetic field, but it's implicit and subliminal. None of the people who participated in the task were consciously aware of magnetic shift changes, even though there were brainwave alterations going on. But I guess our interest in this henceforth is that all of the people who were tested were at Caltech. They were raised in Indo-European languages that they've been speaking from birth, like English, and use left-right systems. As we've seen, the Gurindji spatial orientation ability is so casual and so accurate that it might be that Gurindji people are actually much more consciously aware of the geomagnetic field, but don't necessarily know it. And this is what we're proposing to do with this project. So this is people who are raised in a linguistic and cognitive environment which has an absolute spatial framework, the Cardinal system, and they may then have made associated links to the geomagnetic field. And so people from these cultures then might be able to be consciously aware of the magnetic field. And we're starting to get some ideas that this actually might be the case. So I'm going to report on something now that's unpublished, but it's a task that was run by Cassandra and I last year with 56 participants at Gurindji. And we got some results that, to be honest, I was actually surprised about. So this is a shell magnetic task. You can see myself and Cassandra performing the task. What happened was we had a table that had 4 cups sitting on it. There were cards, A, B, C, D, you can see in the middle of the slide there. What would happen is I would roll a dice, match the number to the letter, because we had a coding system that you can kind of see in the middle of the table there. And then I would walk out of the tent. So in the tent also is partly to block off our view of each other. So this could be a double blind experimental task, but it's also there because we've got a GoPro camera that's mounted at the top of the tent. Okay, so I would first of all shuffle the cups, then Cassandra would walk in, re-roll the dice, and then move the magnet according to the number corresponding to the movement on one of those cards again. So then I would walk back in with the participant, and the participant would walk around the table. They might hover their hand over the cup. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. And then they'd choose a cup. And I guess they had 1 in 4 chance of getting the magnet. Under the cups there was 1 actual magnet and then 3 equally weighted discs. So they did this 10 times. As I said, there were 56 participants and then three people that we repeated. And the reason that we repeated those 3 people were there are actually 3 people who performed well above chance on this task, who got 7 and 9 times could actually find the magnet under the cup. So what I'm going to do now, this is a 3-minute long video, but just to convince you that this really is the case, this is one of the participants performing the task. What you want to focus on in the video is when he lifts a cup up, you can see that the magnet's actually got a colour on it, so you can kind of tell that he's detected the magnet. So this is the second rendition of the task that he did the next day, and he actually found the magnet 9 times out of 10, which is extraordinary. So I'll just play this for you so that you believe us. All I'm doing with this is an edited video so that you're just seeing him walking in, looking at the cup. And what I've done is edited out Cassandra and I walking in and out of the tent and shuffling the cups, because otherwise the video goes for 20 minutes. That was me swearing. So this time he gets it wrong because he's using the repeat pattern for these. Yep. So that was 9 out of 10 trials that he got right. So there were 3 participants in the community who did this, 2 who repeated it, who were able to repeat it the next day. And I have to say, this task was done, it was really hot. It was over 40 degrees. The camera kept failing in the top of the tent because it was 50 degrees. This is Celsius in the top of the tent. So for a lot of people, you know, the results might have actually been a bit higher actually had there not been so much heat stress around, but we'll see. Okay, so that was just a bit of a teaser for work we're doing at the moment. So I just want to, yeah, so he, yeah, no. So we talked to him afterwards and he just said, oh, I don't know, I just knew. Yeah. So it's obviously something we're pretty interested in as well as how, what kind of, how this is described, I guess, this ability. So I'll just conclude and then maybe we can have some more questions. So I think it's worth remembering that there has been a very long and brutal history of experimenting on Indigenous people and other marginalised groups. And much of this work has been focused on deficits and really has been ensconced in the colonial project. This work that we're doing on spatial cognition brings linguistics and science to the task of describing what is an extraordinary ability in Indigenous people in Australia, and then that really sets them apart for non-Indigenous people. Gurindji people, as they will tell you themselves, are firmly embedded in country, and this way of being in the world finds its expression in language, spirituality and cultural practices. It's perhaps the case that all human populations have this ability, at one point perhaps a conscious ability, but it might be that modern life sedentary practices have meant that this ability has been diminished in Western populations. And this is something that we're very interested in with this project. Thanks very much.
We have plenty of time for questions. So Felicity, could I ask that you repeat the question?
Yeah.
So that people on the Zoom can hear it.
Sure. And I might not answer all of the questions. You might be the better person for some of them, Joe. Yep.
Is it known whether people with geocentric language background like how accurate are their assignments of cardinal direction?
Oh yes, sorry. So the question is people with egocentric systems, how accurate their geocentric systems, how accurate they are.
Are there, when they make an assignment of the north or west or whatever,
yep,
are they quantitatively accurate or do they tend to be sort of
yeah, no, so this sort of work's been done across the world, so people are accurate. Within Australia, there's often a 30-degree, I guess, angle that a direction can sort of take place. So there aren't words like, for instance, southwest or northeast or that sort of thing. So you get about a 30-degree angle, if that answers your question. Yeah.
Related question. Do you know the declination at the location of the Gurindji lands? And do they point to true north or magnetic?
They point to true north. So it's aligned according to the sun. Yep.
Yeah, just two questions. One, so if they're lost, do they use the local landmarks in their pointing directions? And then the second question is, you know, that little magnet should have like basically feel the head that's less than the Earth's magnetic field. So I'm wondering why you think they'd be able to have some kind of magnetic.
Okay, so I'll answer the first question. Joe can answer the second question. The first question, what happens when you're lost? Well, I can just give some anecdotal sort of stories about this. So, you know, landmarks are obviously really useful. They're, you know, useful in all systems, but what we're interested in are the mapping of angular relations. And that's why we're interested in either left-right systems or north, south, east and west. I can tell you that when we're in strange places, so for instance, we had an art exhibition in Sydney a number of years ago. I was with Cassandra. It was Cassandra who, I was completely lost and Cassandra found her way back to the hotel. So that's in a place where Cassandra had never been before. I had actually been in Sydney, but was still lost. And so that none of that was based on landmarks. That was entirely based on, you know, direction.
How would they assign east and west?
According to the direction of the sun. Yep. So that was one of the first things I think you did when we landed, right, was look for the sun. Yeah. And Joe, you could answer that second question.
The second question about the intensity of the anomaly. We calibrated magnets carefully before we sent them to Australia. The anomaly at about half a meter or so is about 0.1% of the background. I mean, the anomaly is a few hundred nanometers. But we know from other experiments like honeybee conditioning experiments, they can be trained to a 25 nanotesla anomaly very reliably between two coordinates. It's a separate sense than the direction sense. It's an ancient sense. Your eye detects colors that evolved from a monochromatic thing. Magnetoreception also evolved differently. You know what is the compass? Then there's an intensity sense, which is a little bit more mysterious, but equally powerful. I think humans have both. I don't know if the Zoom people.
Yeah, maybe you should come around this side in case there's other questions that you might answer. I think that.
Two questions if there's time, but one otherwise. And the first question would be, if people learn a geocentric language, do they also become better, I guess maybe you haven't tested this, but would you predict that they would become better also at kind of getting the cardinal directions right, even if the sun is not present?
Yeah, well, certainly the NeoOrphans would predict that, but we don't have examples of this, right? So most of the language change that's going across the world is from smaller indigenous languages that do have these kinds of systems to colonial languages, which will have relative left-right systems. So the only kinds of studies that we can do are from geocentric systems to relative systems. We can't go the other way, unfortunately. Yeah. But, you know, there is evidence of this. So there's been some informal studies. There was one done in Alice Springs, which is in Central Australia, with non-Indigenous people who work for the Central Land Council. The Central Land Council manages a lot of the traditional homelands of Aboriginal people across the territory. Those people are English speakers, but spend probably most of their time with Aboriginal people. And actually they do perform better on dead reckoning kind of tasks. So that might be the sort of closest approximation to, I think, what you're thinking about.
And then second question, I know from Joe's work, he said when people get MRIs, their magnetoperception like plummets. Is that something that's, I guess, concerning in language? Because, right, that's like balancing culture.
Well, the MRI data is based on one individual so far, but is an extraordinarily clear effect. We don't know about if this affects the Indigenous people of Australia.
Yeah.
We don't know.
And that person regained their
After a year.
So
yeah.
that was it. It was a temporary effect. Yeah, I mean, it's something big of concern.
Ed in the back.
People work together with other well.
Which part are you talking about as being
The
language? Yeah, so
Repeat the question.
yeah, so the question is whether this cardinal system or other kinds of geocentric systems are have been studied elsewhere. Yeah, so there was a large research project at the Max Planck Institute in Nijmegen that was led by Steve Levinson, and there were many linguistic studies done across the world with people using different kinds of systems. So for instance, in Mesoamerica, the Saltal use a slope system, a sort of uphill downhill system. I said before, there's other people who use river drainage systems. In the Pacific, the most common system is a seaward landward system because Australia's the main place where this is this kind of cardinal systems used. Papua New Guinea is one place. Yep.
I was wondering about people who sail, who use stars and the sun. Do they have a cardinal system of language as well? Navigators.
Yeah, so that's yeah. So I guess the question is whether people who are navigators, people who read stars and that sort of thing, what sort of system they have. One thing that hasn't been studied enough probably are non-Indigenous populations who have relative systems but actually use navigation a lot in their everyday life, in terms of work and that sort of stuff. I think that's interesting work that needs to be done. And also people from different kinds of cities. So some cities like Melbourne in Australia, the streets are actually on sort of north-south and east-west kind of axes, and people use those terms more than they do in Brisbane, where I come from, where the streets go all over the place. So that's work that needs doing.
But primitive people who are navigators would be
yeah, sure. And this has been the subject of this talk, I think. Yep. So Indigenous people across Australia have connections right across the continent for thousands of years. You can see this through song cycles, for instance, where there's shared song cycles right across the country. So there was, enormous amounts of navigation going on all the time. Yep. So this sort of system would be vital,
Yeah, I have lots of questions raised later, but just picking up one. I want to see final analysis of languages, because we discussed language first, perception first question. So you analyze in terms of which language native, which language learn first, or in extreme cases like Gurindji offspring raised entirely exclusively English environment.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Yeah, so I guess the question is, is this about culture, genetics, or language, right? So if you have a Gurindji person who's raised entirely as an English speaker, and there was a really awful history of taking children away from Gurindji country in the early days called stolen generations. The question is whether they would, as English speakers, have the same cognitive abilities. Yep, I don't know. It's a very interesting question. In the community itself, most children are growing up hearing Gurindji around them, speaking Gurindji Creole, and only encountering English really when you go to school. Other than that, it's just, television and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, you brought up an example of saying something's on the west of my leg. When they describe body parts, do they say left leg and right leg, or Western leg and Eastern leg?
Yep, the latter. Yep, the older generation do. Yep. So there are, as I said, there are words for right hand and left hand, but they're like body parts, the same as a nose and an eye, that sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, you can have something landing on your left hand or your right hand, but if it's other parts of the body, that warang part really just extends up to your elbow. Yeah. Cool.
Have you ever had anyone of the Gurindji people have the opportunity to go neuromagnetic?
No. This is the first time overseas for the 3 Gurindji colleagues who are with me. So, yeah.
Do Gurindji people have handedness in the same sense that Western people do? Are they mostly right-handed?
No. Leah, do you want to come and answer this question or no? Okay. So yeah, no, the left-handed, right-handed people in the same way. I don't know the percentage of the population, but for instance, there's a tradition of making left-hand boomerangs, and there are explanations in the community as to why people are left-handed and right-handed. And we've actually been looking at some of the medical literature, and I think there's some things that maybe have been missed by Western medicine, actually, that certainly Gurindji women who've birthed babies know about. So, yeah. So there's left-hand, right-hand people. Yeah. In fact, well, just a silly anecdote, but once when I was helping cut down trees to make coulamons, as usual, as a white fella, I was doing a terrible job of it, and I had the video camera on, and I could hear Biddy and Violet in the background saying, "Oh, maybe she's left-handed," because I was doing such a bad job of it.
Leah was mentioning maybe it was the umbilical.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. Yeah, just Leah.
There's a question in the chat that's asking, can you say something about geocentric the past and future and explaining related events?
So what I was referring to, this is in the sign language, is the fact that yesterday and tomorrow are signed along an east-west axis. So in the sign language, those are the ways that you refer to past and future tense, whether something's going to occur tomorrow or yesterday. So in that sense, if you're saying I'm going to catch the bus tomorrow, that sort of thing, you'll sign on that east-west axis. Yeah, I think that answers the question. Thanks.
Well, is that true for saying before or after?
No, as far as I know, not. No, it's not as, it's still much more connected to the trajectory of the sun than something like before and after is. Yeah. Yeah. So it's not, I guess in linguistics, we'd say it hasn't grammaticalized to that extent. But yeah, potentially that's something you might predict. Well,
this is speculation. Mostly all we did have to speak for 10,000 years ago. Ideas on what would have led to its loss. And I'm not just building, I'm talking about the part
oh, right.
I can imagine
Yep.
aspects of living in cities, of literacy in particular.
Yep. Yep, and agriculture, probably originally agriculture. So when a lot of Western cultures started using agriculture, that increased to increasingly sedentary life and less navigation requirements in everyday life. So to speculate, that would have made a big difference. Literacy practices came in with trade. Trade came in with surpluses, which is also linked to agriculture. And those literacy systems are also really deeply embedded in the left-right systems. So I think that cluster of cultural practices is probably, it could well be the case that, English as it was spoken, and it wasn't spoken like this, of course, but thousands of years ago, the predecessors, the Proto-Germanic speakers may well have used cardinal directions much more than, we do now as a Western sedentary literate nation. To speculate.
There's another question in the chat. Somebody's asking, do the cardinal paradigm and the river flow paradigm overlap in usage, or are they used in distinct contexts within the flow language?
Yep, so the river direction system and the cardinal system, I didn't show an example of this, but I have lots of stories from many of the Gurindji women elders who I've worked with who will be giving instructions to me about where we're going, and they use both the river system and the cardinal system together. They tend to use the river system much more in association with rivers. The groups in Northern Australia who only have a river system have a much more abstracted way of using those river drainage systems. So it's the cardinal system that's much more fundamental for Gurindji mob.
So this system like fully based on the direction of the sun. Did it I guess under culture in its language developed, did they have any kind of access or knowledge of this or something that did it just that?
Not to my knowledge, and not that we've ever talked about. And Leah's shaking her head over here. So okay. Yeah, so no. It's not.
For the animals in the road model, were Gurindji speakers also given the task in English, or if they were, did they display the same difference to non-Gurindji speakers?
Yeah, also an interesting question. So we didn't do the task in English, so I can't answer the question to that. But you might speculate, so if you have bilingual speakers, that you could actually stimulate a relative response depending on the language that you're using the task. So yeah, it's a fair question and something that could be looked at.
When you're facing north, the sun rises on your right, sets on your left. So time, in a sense, when you're facing north, goes this way.
Yeah.
But if you're facing south, it goes the other way. So which is early, which is late? Is over there early and over there is late?
So I guess east is early and west is late, if that's what you mean with that question.
Yeah, well, that's, that, if you were facing north, east would be early in the day, and west would be
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
If you were facing south, it would be night.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, we should thank Felicity. Certainly accommodate one.